Alrighty then. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Matthew Baker of Beautiful New York Tours. Broadway theater is certainly one of the biggest draws in the New York City tourism industry, if not the biggest. And I've done a few videos now that talk about Broadway theater. We did one on the birth of Broadway, and we did one on the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, which was my alma mater. But I'd like to concentrate today on one particular theater that's had an interesting history, and that's the Hudson Theatre on 44th Street. And the Hudson had been managed by Renee Harris, which is interesting because she was the first female producer and theater manager in Broadway history. And Renee Harris, who was a very well-to-do widow, she had been married to Henry B. Harris, who had managed the theater beforehand, and they took a trip together on the RMS Titanic. Renee did not want to leave her husband on the Titanic. She actually climbed out of a lifeboat, and it took a lot of coaxing to get her back into one. She ended up coming back into the very last lifeboat to leave the Titanic. When she returned to New York, utterly devastated, she insisted that she would not sell her husband's assets, even once it was discovered that his debts far outweighed them. Well, that's not unusual in the theater business, but she said to simply sell off his theaters would be an insult to his memory, and she refused to do that. So instead, she took up the mantle and started producing plays, and she wound up being a pretty brilliant producer. She mentored and gave early opportunities to young playwrights like Moss Hart, and to young performers like a chorus dancer that she saw in a nightclub named Ruby Stevens, who later changed her name to Barbara Stanwyck. And it was Harris who gave her her first speaking role on Broadway. Now, the Great Depression hit Harris hard, and she ultimately had to start selling off assets in order to make ends meet. By 1932, she lost the Hudson Theatre, and the only thing she was able to take away from it was a portrait of her late husband. She died in dire straits at the age of 93 in the 1960s, but her husband had always been a great advocate for the Actors Fund, so during Harris's rocky later years, the Actors Fund became a supporter of her. Now, as for the Hudson Theatre, it fell prey to the bad old days of Times Square in the 1960s, sometimes showing pornographic movies, sometimes simply laying dormant, eventually in the 1980s becoming an event space for the adjacent hotel, what is today the Millennium Hotel, finally reopened as a Broadway theater just a couple of years ago. And the interesting thing about that is that means that having initially opened in 1903, the Hudson Theatre is both the oldest and newest theater on Broadway. In its original incarnation, the Hudson Theatre was the home of the original productions of such classic chestnuts as Arsenic and Old Lace, The State of the Union, Detective Story, and Toys in the Attic. When it reopened in the teens, it was the home of a very well-received revival of the Pulitzer Prize-winning musical Sunday in the Park with George. Since then, while it has done original works, it has been revivals of classic works that have really kept the Hudson afloat, including its disturbing adaptation of 1984 and its recently highly acclaimed revival of Burn This by Lanford Wilson. So the Hudson really begins to sort of represent what Broadway has always been. It is innovative and nostalgic. It is lucrative and impoverished. It is the human condition, and that is part of what makes people love theater so much. So a lot has been said about what it's going to take for Broadway to reopen and when. There are people that are saying it won't open until after Labor Day. There are people saying it won't open until next January. Whenever it does, definitely catch a Broadway show, including perhaps one at the Hudson. When you are ready, please check me out at Beautiful New York Tours. You can search Beautiful New York Tours on Facebook or email me at baker.tours@yahoo.com. Again, that is baker.tours at Yahoo. Thank you very much.